Our first panel, Annenberg Redux, explores whether we've all really lost our collective memory about the failure of attempts to implement sweeping, broad-based, one-size-fits-all, district-wide education reforms to change the whole system all at once. Why do we stay so enamored with it when it's been tried and failed over and over? Are people new to the movement, like Mark Zuckerberg and his $100 million pledge, just too young to remember that this has been tried and failed? Our moderator, David Hardy. In 2005, David had the vision of creating an all-boys charter school in urban Philadelphia. After initially being denied a charter, Hardy led a petition drive that successfully overturned that decision. Boys Latin is the first and only single-gender charter school in Philadelphia. Mike Antonucci has covered the education beat since 1993 and is the current education director of the Education Intelligence Agency, EIA, established in June 1997 as a private, for-profit, one-man contract research firm focused on the inner workings of the teachers' unions. Ted Coldery has worked on questions of system design in not only education, but in public finance, transportation, healthcare, and government structure. Ted was involved in the design and enactment of Minnesota's chartering legislation and in the discussions about chartering in about 24 other states. Ted co-founded Education Evolving to be a nonpartisan, non-commercial, non-governmental, and non-academic, anything else, policy group working on strategies for innovation in the K-12 arena. Bob Maranto is the 21st Century Chair in Leadership at the Department of Education Reform at the University of Arkansas and previously taught at Villanova, served in government in the Clinton years. He has written nearly a dozen books, including President Obama and Education Reform and The Politically Correct University, and is currently working on, a book about KIPP and another about Arizona charter schools. Debbie Mcgriff, good timing. A partner at New Schools Venture Fund, has been transforming urban education for more than 4 decades. Debbie became the first public school superintendent to join Edison Learning, and before that served as the first female superintendent of Detroit Public Schools and helped lead the Cambridge, Massachusetts and Milwaukee, Wisconsin systems. Debbie was a teacher and administrator in the New York City Public Schools for more than a decade and is the chair of the board of the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools. Let me turn it over to Dave.
Thank you, Brian. It's really a pleasure to be here with such a distinguished panel. I'm going to start with Mike. Mike, could you tell us a little bit about the role that unions have played in the attempts to reform the system? A lot of people focus on unions. Some people think unfairly. Some people think that's the right place, and we need you to kind of illuminate us on illuminate that area.
Well, sure thing. The teachers' unions have been in the business of protecting themselves for a very long time, and I use that term very specifically because we tend to think of them as being in the business of protecting teachers, but we have to remember that the unions are in very many ways a separate entity from the teachers. They are agents of the teachers, but if you look at your standard collective bargaining agreement in the school district, there are really 3 parties to that agreement. And one is the school district, one is the workers, the teachers and the education support employees, but the other is the union. There are a lot of provisions in the collective bargaining agreement that deal directly with the operations of the union, what protections the union has, how much release time the union officers get. So I think a lot of the problems that people run into when they approach the unions is they don't realize that they're dealing with 2 separate entities. They're trying to do things that will either please or appease the employees without recognizing that the teachers union itself has its own interests and its own agenda. Now, sometimes these things do overlap with what the teachers want, but other times it doesn't. I don't think you'll ever see a group of teachers go out on strike because the union officers didn't get enough release time. But these are things that are continually negotiated into these contracts, so that neophytes, even people with a lot of money, go into a district thinking they're going to make some big changes, and they may even do things that they think the teachers will support without recognizing that it's something that's anathema to the union. And so if you go into education reform without looking at the labor component of it, you're pretty much doomed to failure. You at least have to have a strategy for dealing with the labor aspects of any education reform you take up.
One other quick follow-up. In Philadelphia, where I'm from, we're in a big fight with the teachers union, or the district is, and one of the key components two key components of the fight is that the district asks the school teachers to take a pay cut, and they ask them to give up seniority. Mm-hmm. In my mind, seniority is the bigger thing. Could you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's a big topic. I'll try to be as brief as possible, but the key reason that the unions want to defend seniority at all costs is because they don't trust the administrators to make a subjective judgment about the quality of teachers. And so they focus on seniority because it's mathematically indisputable. You know, this teacher was hired in 1985, and this one was hired in 1986. There's no question about it. So let's keep the one that's been working here a little bit longer. There's no judgment involved. And so the defense of seniority is really an indicator of the lack of trust that the union has for the discretion of school administrators. And one thing I always like to point out when it comes to seniority is the situation is so bad that most teacher union contracts have a provision in it that if seniority is equal, that if two teachers were hired on the same day, and in large districts like Philadelphia, that happens all the time. A bunch of teachers are hired on the same day. They all start on the same day. If that's the case, if the seniority is equal, then you have to use a random method when it comes to layoffs and rehiring. Some of them even spell it out. It's got to be a coin flip. It's got to be a lottery, something like that. Rather, even in that very circumscribed situation, to allow the administrator to choose the best teacher to keep in that situation. So I think you'll find, not only with seniority, but with most provisions of a collective bargaining agreement, that it's a lack of trust between one side and the other as to why these things come about.
Thank you. One of the things that the Annenberg challenge has did when they did it is give a lot of money to school districts for them to change things, but we didn't see any structural changes. So Ted, can you tell us a little bit about kind of the structure of school districts and why they're so resistant to change?
Well, I wrote a piece about this back in 1990, trying to lay out the consequences of having K-12 arranged as a public utility form, and sent that around the country. It sent a couple hundred copies around in the mail. This was well before the internet and everything, and I've always it seemed to have, if you could use the phrase, pick up a current phrase, it kind of went viral through the Xerox machines. A couple of times I had people call me and ask for a clean copy because the one I have has been copied so many times it won't copy anymore. So it it seemed to make an impression, and the essential argument was that the district system represented a commitment by the state to guarantee those organizations almost everything they wanted with respect to their economic interests. Their students, and if their students were guaranteed essentially their revenues, most everything that mattered except the annual increase which they had to go work for. And that this guarantee of economic success to the district was a state commitment, was valid whether or not the district changed and improved and whether or not the students learned. And I think that was true in the 1991 period. And simply said that for a country serious about improvement, that was an absurd arrangement. And it had to be changed, and it was very rapidly through the 90s. A combination of choice, public school choice came in, some private school choice, and the development of schools under the chartering laws. Partly inside but partly outside the district framework, and where we are, pushing 25 years later, it doesn't seem like that can be reversed. Those changes are here to stay. It's like somebody said at the meeting in Philadelphia last week that Anthony, wherever Anthony is, organized there. We now have a real de facto kind of a portfolio arrangement. So there are. I can't be sure of this. I think people in the business community and the foundations have learned that negotiating change and improvement with the district is not like buying a house. You buy a house, you push a check across the table, and the district and the party on the other side pushes a deed back to you, and the deal's done. The district can't do that. You push a check across the table, and what you get back is an IOU, a promise to deliver the changes and improvements later. And too many people for too long have accepted that kind of an exchange and then discovered that the promised changes and improvements don't get made, but at that point your money's gone, there's nothing you can do about it. So it seems to me that's, I think we've kind of made that sort of progress. I would call it progress, and we're ready to go on to some other issues from here, which hope we can talk about.
Well, I think what you're kind of saying is that the train has left the station on these options, and that they're here to stay. But as somebody who's down in the field working those options, it appears to me that the assault on us and our existence is unrelenting. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that. How entrenched are these systems, and how much will they fight to keep us from existing?
The situation is continually changing. This is not something that's ever done, and so that the key is always to have an initiative. If you don't push forward, you will get pushed backwards. Like a friend of mine used to say, that nothing is not going to stand still. So we try to think about the questions that the reform effort is confronted with. Clearly, Ted Rebarber and I were talking about this before the meeting. All of this growth of regulatory barnacles around chartering laws. When Ember Reichgott, who's here, will be on the next panel, got the chartering law through in Minnesota in '91. The understanding was that the schools would be subject only to the law and regulation as specifically provided in the legislation. But in the 20 years since, every time the legislature enacts some kind of new requirement or regulation or restriction for the district system, as more and more control moves up to the state level, their legislature is determined to, include charter schools in that. So that's a development that needs to be, you try to find some way to deal with. Another one is that I think people who are interested in choice need to think about. I'm not sure I fully understand all this, or certainly sure I don't know the answer, but the standardization of schooling that's going on is a concern. In St. Paul, for example, the new superintendent, as of a couple of years ago, really eliminated choice in the district, partly to save on the transportation budget, but the idea was that we have the same school everywhere, so there would be no point in moving. And they have St. Paul has I forget which is which. One of the cities, Minneapolis, St. Paul, talks about focused instruction. The other one talks about, has some other term for it, but the notion is that we must do the same thing at all the schools. And this I think needs to be a concern for people involved in choice. We can talk some more about some of the implications of this if you want.
Okay, thank you very much. Bob, you've had a chance to look at some of the broad spectrum of reform across the country and to make some judgments from looking at that history. Could you give us a little bit of your perspective on that?
I think, too close, too far, I don't know. This is a fascinating area, and it's got all kinds of fascinating elephants in the room that people can't very easily talk about. And let me give you a couple of examples. Last night, I went out to dinner here with two dear friends of mine. One works for a law firm. One's a CIA analyst, currently furloughed and enjoying it. And I told them, last week I was at a meeting, and I will not name the university, but a meeting of a committee at a reasonably prominent school of education. And they were looking over their student GRE scores for their masters, and actually for their mostly PhD students, people who will be, or already are, principals and superintendents. And they found their mean GREs in math were in the bottom 20%, in English in the bottom 11%. And my friends were horrified by this. And I said, well, that's how the system works. I mean, we have a system that, and Rick Hess is a wonderful book, about 3 years old now, the same thing over and over again. We have a system where people are more or less guaranteed lifetime jobs through tenure, unless they really screw up. And we have a system where if you go to the American Educational Research Association's annual meeting, and I do every year, and I'm not sure I would urge you to or not, but one of the mantras, a key ideology of AERA, is that we can't really teach kids. Really, poverty, family breakdown, things like that determine where kids are going to end up. Your own efforts as a teacher don't really matter. Your own efforts as an administrator don't really matter. Now, if you have that system where people can't really be fired, you're not necessarily recruiting the best and the brightest. You used to, back when women weren't allowed to do other things, but since the oppression of women has ended, two people I had dinner with last night were women. 40 years ago, they would have been teachers. Now they're working for CIA and law and so on. You no longer have a system where you have a captive audience for labor, and you have this view that your efforts don't matter, and you have a situation where you can't really be fired. What kind of folks are you going to get in the system, right? They're not going to be the most effective people necessarily. They're not going to be the people who are going to look to innovate, going to look to make changes. They're going to be sort of exactly the opposite of the folks that say David hires for his school, to take one example. So we've got a system that's very hard to change. We've also got a system where, and I disagree with Ted here for a moment, St. Paul has lots of school choice. Aside from the charter schools, people who want choice, they move to the suburbs, they work a deal with the system, they do all kinds of things middle and upper class parents do. Only low-income parents really don't have choice when you come down to it. And people who don't really matter that much generally. And so the people like me, the middle class folks, we're bought off. You know, we can go in, and maybe in the junior high where my kid is, maybe 2/3 of the teachers are kind of mediocre, but you know what? I'm a parent in the know. I know the 1/3 who aren't mediocre, and guess who's going to teach my kids? So we've got a system that's very non-transparent and very inequitable and not terribly effective. But the people in the system, first off, are convinced ideologically that this is the right way to go, right? That this is all right. AERA tells them it's right. But these are also people that folks argue are teachers underpaid or overpaid. And, you know, it really depends. I mean, my son had an amazing algebra teacher last year. He made like 3 years progress in 1 year. I would say she is, I don't know what she's making, but I'm pretty sure she's dramatically underpaid. On the other hand, I've seen teachers that if they're making minimum wage, they're dramatically overpaid. Right? Now, for recruiting people that generally, they're the bottom quarter of college graduates, they don't have a lot of other options. It's not like, oh, do I want to go to med school or teach? It's like, oh, do I want to teach or be a house painter? Nothing wrong with being a house painter, but it doesn't pay that well. You know, so the people in the system, they firmly believe in the system. They'll really fight to preserve it because they don't really necessarily have other great options. Right? They look down on TFA people who maybe stay and maybe go. TFA types have lots of options. People we want in the system are people who have lots of options and choose to be there, like the people who work for David's school, for some of the better charter schools, for some of the better districts here and there. I mean, it's a long, rambling soliloquy, but it talks about why it's so hard for us to change. We're taking on entrenched interests, entrenched ideologies, systems that pay off people like me who otherwise would probably make more trouble. And the thing that we have on our side, I think, is that elites realize that. I'd urge you to read Barack Obama's autobiography that he wrote way before he was running for president, which actually is a pretty good book and I think there's a lot of clues to the man. He writes about how he, as a community organizer, tried to change the Chicago public schools. And he more or less gave up. He said any new program he'd have, principals would just co-opt it for patronage. And he said, you know, the teachers in the system were certainly not sending their kids to Chicago public schools, but they're mostly black teachers. But they would defend the system with just as much fervor as the white teachers would a generation earlier, a system that was not really serving low-income African-American and Hispanic kids. And we have a lot of people like President Obama who sort of realize this is not a good system. And because of that, because we reformers have won the battle of ideas, I think over the next 20, 30, 40 years, incrementally, the system will change. I had a discussion in an airport, we were in a line in an airport 7, 8 years back with Dave Levin, co-founder of KIP. Ted Calder was at the conference, I remember, and first met Ted. And David said, he said, you know, I think over the next 20 years, our goal is to remake public education, especially urban education, for the next 20 years, and I think we're going to do it. And I kind of made fun of him, and I said, nah, you're not going to do it. It's not going to happen. It's 8 years later, I think David Levin was right and I was wrong, I am glad to say. It's going to take a while. Social change always takes a while. My gosh, look at the civil rights movement, of which you can argue this is really a part. Everything takes a long time, but I think it's going to happen. It's a long, rambling answer. I hope I kind of hit it.
Thanks. Thank you. Debbie, how you doing?
I'm great. How are you?
Just fine.
Now that I've changed my time zones accurately.
Well, you were there during the Annenberg years, and you saw that money go across the country, and a lot of people complained about it, but you saw some good things and some bad things, and I really would like you to share your perspective on the whole Annenberg challenge.
Let me take a step back first, because by 1995, I had already spent 2.5 decades in traditional urban school districts. And unfortunately, my point of view is not as bleak as what I've just heard. And mainly because the places where I worked were all large urban school districts, but they were all urban school districts, or at least in the part of the district that I worked. We were always into school improvement, school reform initiatives. I never worked in the part of the district that was about maintaining the system. in every system that I worked in, parents had choice. The kids were low income, but they had choice. We were developing small schools in New York City with Alvarado and Jerome Harris long before Gates had a small schools initiative. And small schools were sharing buildings. So I'm with you. What goes around comes around, but people who talk about it now have no sense of what was happening in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. I was also, when I was deputy superintendent in Milwaukee, and the superintendent and I supported the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program, which gave poor kids vouchers to go to private schools. So I just say that to say I have been, even when I was in the system, I was about transforming the system and excellence for all kids. So by 1995, when Annenberg announced their work, I was at Edison Schools. And as the introduction indicated, I got Edison's first contract with the Mount Clemens, Michigan School District. So even though I was outside of the school with a for-profit company, my goal within that school was to make sure that communities with high concentrations of low-income children had an opportunity to build and open schools. And as a result of that, there are Black-led charter schools operating today independently that were launched as a part of the Edison Project, which gave them money to build a great school, to partner with someone to learn the skills for operating a quality school. So I still got to from Edison by any means necessary. And on the union piece, I was the next to be laid off in New York City during the layoffs cycle there under Koch. And the person that would have kept his job, everybody knew was not a good teacher, but I was gonna be the one to go next if we had not stopped laying off folks. I had a strike my second year as superintendent in Detroit, and I had the district, the union in Detroit, suspend an innovation on empowered schools that they supported. Because when they supported it, they didn't think I had the ability to get schools to take on that level of autonomy. As more and more schools signed on to be empowered to manage their own budget, their own curriculum, they were like, oh no, we don't want to do this anymore. So, but despite all of that, I don't focus on the union as the major problem. I think the major problem is no commitment to quality, no accountability, and no ability to give people who have great solutions autonomy to put those in place. And I'll give you an example. For the last couple of years, I've been working with turnarounds at new schools. And of all the money being spent on the lowest performing schools in the country, 75% of the money is spent on a model called transformation. When you look at the impact, the transformational model is the least effective. But at new schools, we would never invest in a transformational model. And we have operators like Mastery in Philadelphia that we've invested in, Unlocking Potential in Boston. But in every case, we invest only in a place where the entrepreneur is going to have total control over hiring the teachers and their administrators on establishing curriculum, control of their budget, and if they're not going to have control to really turn the school around, then don't call it a turnaround. So, and then my final thing that I will say is, even as we work now with the LumaCore Group, which is a coalition of 18 of the highest performing CMOs across the country, and partnering with the Gates Foundation on district charter partnerships, the partnerships are really about implementing strategies that are best practices and have known to work. For example, I'll just give one example. Achievement First and DSST have very strong principal development programs. So they're partnering with their local school districts and helping to train their principals. That's, to me, is going to be a program that works, because if they're training great principals and they're running great of the highest performing charter schools, being able to take those practices back. But you also have to have superintendents of those districts that are also open to that collaboration, and then are going to hold those folks that are being a part of that program accountable. And I see that happening. So I am with you on overall, we have a lot to do to change the system, but because I can only impact a small portion of the system, I find community leaders, superintendents, entrepreneurs who care like I care and will be held accountable for transforming the lives of kids. And when we say transformation, we mean sending low-income, first-generation kids to college, college-ready, staying with them to get them through college, supporting them to get them into graduate school, into fellowships, and providing them with the same social network when they're starting their careers that affluent parents provide for their kids. So if you're about that, I don't care whether you're in a private school, a public school, or a charter school, you can come talk to me, and we'll find a way to work together.
Thank you. We want to turn the discussion to teachers. And Ted wanted to give a dissenting opinion about what we were talking about.
You know, we keep trying to think about it as change. One other thing that we see going on locally, and I guess I'd say to Bob, when I made that reference to St. Paul and the standardization, I'm talking about the district schools, okay? Not, obviously, that one of the districts, the district is trying to do that kind of standardization within a larger choice framework that exists. There are lots of choices for students and parents in the cities. But another thing that's going on, that seems to be going on, is the increased kind of control, almost what you'd call scripting of teachers' work, down to some of the ones in Minneapolis tell us down to 5-minute intervals, told what they're to be doing, exactly what they're to be doing, how they're going to be doing it. This kind of breaks the old deal. I've sort of had a sense the old deal was with teachers that we don't give you professional authority, and in return you don't give us accountability. And that was arguably not a really good deal, but it was sort of stable for a long time. And now, now there is this cry to hold teachers accountable, but in a way that still denies the teachers professional roles and authority. And we're trying to think about this. I mean, these are all, I think, questions that really are or ought to be on the reform agenda. One of the, we're relating it increasingly to the growth and the potential of the digital electronics. Three things were invented in 1991. One was chartering, one was standards-based systemic reform, and the other was the web. Berners-Lee got the code for the web written in late 1991. And this is the biggest thing. I mean, this is just enormous. And the potential is to personalize learning, I think. Has a lot of potentials, but one of them certainly is to personalize learning, which is a dimension of choice that maybe we need to talk about a lot more. That is the differences among students. If you go on the Education Evolving website, ours, you'll find a short little video of a teacher, a man who came in, born in South India actually, who came into teaching at mid-career, got properly certified and went to work and took a look at his third grade classroom and found a range of attainment levels that 10th percentile and below to 90th percentile and above. And what am I supposed to do with this? Well, the district gave him a curriculum that assumed, you have a class here, you teach a class. And this is not a class, this is a range of individuals. So he decided he had to individualize, and it's a very interesting story with a lot of potential and a lot of implications. As we try to think about the digital electronics and the personalization, it just seems to us it's bound to change teaching. Everybody wants to improve teaching. I think we're going to have to ask increasingly what's teaching in a digital, personalized world. But then you ask yourself, who knows the students as individuals? And only the teachers know the students in the school. Only the teachers know the students as individuals. So it seems to us this kind of cries out for a larger professional role for the teachers, a delegation of authority to the school and in the school to the classroom and to the teachers to decide how to plan and arrange and manage and coach individual students. And this is going to, the second thing we've been working with over the last 20, 25 years is the idea of arranging education at the department level in a high school, or at the school level, or at a program level district-wide, more or less in the way that, in the partnership model, which is the way a lot of white-collar vocations are organized. That is where you have the professionals working collegially in a group and handling the questions, and either do the administration themselves or have the administrators working for them. It takes the standard school model and flips it over. And this has turned out to be quite successful, actually. Joe Graven and I took a couple of teachers in charter schools, one in Milwaukee and one in St. Paul, out to Washington in the spring of 2010, and a little discussion with Arnie Duncan and his top staff. Mike Smith was still there at the time, and Joanne Weiss and Karen Cater and Jim Shelton and 15 or so others. And these teachers just explained to them very simply how in this partnership model they make decisions, arrange the learning, manage the school and its finances, and recruit, select, compensate, and when necessary, terminate teachers. So there are the idea of a professional approach to teachers. There's the idea of the reform movement not assuming and accepting that the standard public bureau paramilitary model of school and district organization is eternal, and that you have to just confront the issues that raises, but going underneath to find why the teachers behave the way they do. You know, it just seems to us to make sense. Gene Mamengay said to me once when he was with the MEA that we argue about wages and working conditions because that's all you let us argue about, and that's true. Under the professional decisions at the moment are reserved to boards as a management right, and maybe that's one of the questions we ought to think about.
Well, I just want to bring up this point. You're talking about changes that need to happen to make schools run better, and I think everybody in the room knows we need to change things. I think there are obstacles to change. I think that trying to do what you want to do, you're going to run into obstacles. And Mike, I want you to maybe touch on some of that. What keeps us from doing some of these innovative changes?
Yeah, the system that we have did not come about by accident. We tend to think of it as this thing that's sort of accumulated, but in fact, we have the system that certain groups and certain people want to have. The system is set up to protect and defend the people in the system. And of course, every large bureaucracy is like that. So I think, we've heard people say that, the unions are an obstacle, but we can't blame them for everything. But the mindset that the unions bring has sort of been accepted by everyone involved in the system. You'll notice when the teachers have a labor dispute, they'll often use this tactic called work to rule. And that is, they'll only do what's specifically spelled out in the contract. They won't do any extra work at all. But you'll never hear of a school administrator or a school board working to contract, working to rule, and telling the teachers you have to do exactly what's in the contract. So in many ways, it's a one-way street. Everyone's accepted the way of thinking that, this is the way we do things. And quite a few researchers have noticed that school superintendents and administrators will blame the union for things that they can't do, only to discover that, according to the contract, they can do them. They just thought they couldn't do them. So it's not just a question of the letter of the law saying you can't do X, Y, or Z. It's the will to do X, Y, or Z that's lacking in a lot of these cases. So, you know, we can talk about obstacles, we can blame people for putting things in our way, but at the same time, when there is nothing in our way, we have to have the courage to go ahead and move forward and not pretend that there's a hurdle. And I think we'll get a lot further that way.
I also think we also need to celebrate more the places that have memorandums of understanding with unions that allow schools to operate outside of what the average school in that district, and the people in those buildings had the courage to say, we want to be a Montessori school, we want to be a school of the arts, we want to be whatever it is we want to be, and we're going to negotiate with our union to be able to be different. And I think because we don't talk about those exceptions or those MOUs, we don't allow very creative people to have examples of what they could do with their union to accomplish what they want. And I think the second thing that we tend to do is we pick whatever model we like, and that's all we talk about. We already know that one best system does not work. So if something is educating low-income kids to the levels of affluent kids, then we need to be sharing those practices so people can replicate and scale them, and not always looking for, unless it's my idea, it can't be a good idea.
Let me jump in. I totally agree. Let me jump in with two things. One is a great book that just came out a few months back on the fact that, as Mike points out, there are a lot of blank spaces in contracts. Usually unions are not quite as powerful as we make them out to be. Frederick Hess at AEI, Rick Hess, just came out with Cage Busting Leadership. And for anybody interested in this, I would urge them to read it. It's a very good read. We have a review of it coming out in the Journal of School Choice in a couple of months from a district school superintendent who wanted to be hostile to it and ended up loving it. Second thing I'd say is standardization. I agree with Ted. Standardization, I want some standardization of outcomes, or at least measurement of outcomes, to know where we are, to know where we need to be, to know if we're moving along in the right direction. Standardization of how teachers do their work, how individual schools work, I think is an awful thing. What's interesting is that administrators and unions both find it appealing in some ways, and it sort of makes sense if you don't have extremely competent entrepreneurial teachers. Maybe you do want to micromanage everything they do. It's not going to work very well, but maybe it'll work better than not micromanaging it, and it's something labor and management can often agree on. I don't think it's good for kids, but I think you could maybe argue it's a reflection of lots of other things that have built up over time, though I certainly wouldn't support it.
Yeah. We're going to take this time to take some questions from the audience. So does anyone have a question? Or, yeah, comment?
I have a quick one.
All right.
Maybe mostly for Mike. In these big system attempts for reform, or even some of the more recent smaller ones that Debbie was alluding to, have you seen unions change, or are they the same old, same old?
Well, I guess the problem you find with unions, it depends on whether you have an NEA affiliate or an AFT affiliate, because the AFT, which covers most of the large urban locals, they're very much, I guess you'd call them like independent warlords. They have their own fiefdom, and whatever they do in their district is what they do. It's not necessarily going to carry on elsewhere. So if you happen to have a cooperative, collaborative union president and union board of directors, first of all, consider yourself lucky. Second, that's what you have. You will have that as long as they're in power, and they will carry their union with them. On the other hand, if you have a very hidebound union leadership that's constantly battling against you, you're going to have that forever unless that person gets voted out, which doesn't happen very often. So, you know, it's kind of hard to make a general rule. NEA is a little bit different because they're very much more state-based. What comes down from their state affiliate is what the locals all abide by. But we're talking, especially when we're referring to the Annenberg challenge, we're talking about large urban locals, almost all of those. In fact, I counted the top 10 are all AFT affiliates. So, you know, you may find some change if you've got you know, we've been seeing change going on in Newark because the union president there has been more collaborative than others in the past. But he's getting a little pushback from people on his own board. So the internal union politics of it sometimes affects things, and these are things that you never see. You're involved in the education reform. The people on the school board and the school district, they're wondering why, you know, gee, you were so positive about this last week, now this week you're telling me no. These changes often occur because of the internal union politics, and you know, you can't count on it one way or the other. If you're getting change, be happy about it. If you're collaborative, you don't have to worry about the union as an obstacle. But if you're running into a stone wall, chances are that stone wall is always going to be there.
Can I jump in for a second on something a little different, somewhat related? When we look at philanthropy and the schools, I think a couple of points to make. One is philanthropists give money for a lot of different reasons. Some of them really want to make change. Some of them really want to get their names in the paper and buy respectability. Annenberg, I'm not sure which it was. I know it struck me when I was in Houston a while back, the founder of Yes Prep told me Houston's really remarkable because the foundation community here, they're all just 1 or 2 generations away from being poor. So they're people who really want to make a difference and not just get their faces in the society pages. I thought that was a really interesting thing to say and a contrast with some places. The second thing I wanted to say, the Annenberg challenge idea, I think, was kind of the same notion of, say, the way we fought the Vietnam War or maybe Afghanistan, that if we pour money into systems, things will get better. So if we pour money into the South Vietnamese army, they'll fight better. If we pour money into the Afghan army, they'll fight better. Life is way more complicated than that. You really need to get down in the weeds and understand how organizations function and whether they're more about the mission or more about collecting paychecks or even collecting dead people's paychecks or whatever. Rick Hess has a funny story. One school district started requiring teachers to show up and found that a certain percentage had died or whatever. Someone was collecting the paychecks, who knows who. So the second lesson, you can't just pour in money and hope for the best. The Kansas City reforms, where we tripled spending in 7 years and the schools did not improve, I think had in some ways even more of an impact on policymakers like Barack Obama than the Annenberg challenge did. It's like, we can't just pour money here and hope for the best. On the flip side, there's a different danger that relates to some of what Ted said. The Gates Foundation, I think with good intentions, is pouring money into systems and saying, this is the one way to do things. Do it this way and all will be well. I think that's a vast oversimplification. I think their ways of measuring teaching really have not worked out. They're reluctant to admit it. Their small school initiative in New York took about 3 or 4 years to work, by which time Bill Gates ran out of patience and pulled the plug. But then the evaluations have been showing it worked extremely well. I think that there are dangers with foundations sometimes getting too involved in the weeds and thinking, hey, I'm the brilliant guy, I know how to change everything. So I think there's those twin dangers, just dumping in money and hoping for the best versus being overly prescriptive.
Since New School serves as an intermediary for many of the philanthropies, I have to respond. I think there's a difference between having a strategy that you believe in, and it may mean that that's not all you believe in. But at this moment in time, even New Schools has a strategy, and we're saying here are the 4 areas of ed reform where we're going to search for entrepreneurs and make investments. It doesn't mean that we don't believe that there are other critical levers, but we're just saying at this moment that's not the work that we're going to do because we want to learn this work well, and our work is whether it's replicating CMOs. So when we decide we're going to replicate CMOs in specific geographies like Newark and Boston and DC and Oakland, we make a lot of people mad because then we're not doing work in other places. Or if we do believe teachers are critical and we're focusing on teacher preparation programs. We're not saying that professional development or teachers leading schools are not important, but if we're going to change education, you better change the places that are preparing teachers if you want to make changes in the long run. We do agree that digital learning is extremely important. And so we're helping to develop the digital tools that will enable teachers to share best practices, share lessons, to differentiate and personalize learning. Because we don't think one teacher in a classroom by themselves with that range of kids with no additional support. So we're trying to say, what are the things that are likely to be most impactful? And then we're constantly looking for around the corner. What are some interesting things that might be the next set of things? But when people look at us, they're still going to criticize us, because if you call me and say, I want you to invest in us, and I'm saying you don't fit our strategy, I can't then help you. Right. And we disagree with funders because we want them to fund what we believe. But they have every right, if it's their money, to look around the landscape and decide the places where they think they can make an impact in education.
Let's wrap things up here and move on to our next panel. We did have a question come in over Twitter from Creo, wondering if any of these system reforms or reforms in general did achieve success in the Latino community. I hope that somebody addresses it at some point, and surely we'll discuss it here. But thank you.
Could I just add, I would just mention looking at Rocket Ship Education, which is one of our ventures in San Jose, California, and the majority of the students in Rocket Ship schools are Hispanics. They are performing as well as affluent districts in the state, and luckily in their expansion of their first school outside of California, they decided to come to Milwaukee, and they opened in September.
Let me jump in. KIPP and Yes Prep, of course, but something that's not on anybody's radar screen, but a remarkable set of schools. The Dove Science Academy schools in Oklahoma, at least a couple of their campuses are overwhelmingly Hispanic. One year had the best test scores in the state, actually. Remarkable set of schools, and I can give you the contact info there.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.